Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the First Stars Podcast 5th season. Be sure to like and subscribe. Enjoy this amazing episode because Neo Ross boards the mothership. He's the legendary actor behind Springer from the original Transformers film and Shipwreck and G.I. Joe, the Real American Hero. Now come aboard and go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Ross. Thank you for coming to the First Stars Podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's totally my honor. So, as I was looking through your history, you've been you have 284 credits as an actor. What is the key to your longevity?
I think probably persistence and practice and patience, the three P's. I was never welcomed with open arms, but I just kept showing up, and finally they would say, all right, come in, if you must.
Well, the interesting thing is, throughout your career, the industry of from radio to voice acting to what it is nowadays has changed and evolved many times. So, how do you adapt to meet the changing needs of a voice acting career?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if I'm typical, but I think most young people sort of have, and me included, have this attitude of, well, now that I'm here, nothing will change. And of course, the only thing you can absolutely count on in life is change.
Yep.
And so, really, part of survival is a constant job of reinvention. You constantly chasing what in voiceovers, what I used to call the invisible dartboard. You show up at an audition and they have the vaguest idea of what they think they want, and as I say, it's like trying to hit a bullseye with an invisible target. And you keep trying to figure out what is it they want now, because the read keeps changing, and it's a challenge. But we all know people who dress like they did 20 years ago, and I told my daughter this when she was young. I said, no matter how cool you think you are at any given moment, in 20 years, you'll look at a picture of yourself and go, oh my God, look at my hair. It's ridiculous. And these clothes. What was I thinking? Which is why I always urge her not to get a tattoo, at least when you're young. Because I guarantee you that the tattoo that's so bitchin' when you're 20 is going to be a total embarrassment 10 years later. And you can't, throw it away like a tie-dye t-shirt. It's stuck there on your epidermis. But we're not here to talk about tattoos, so.
Well, I mean, I can't help to think one of the biggest changes in voice acting has to do with you're no longer, at least for when I talk to a lot of voice actors, you're no longer in the studios anymore. You're no longer acting with somebody else. You're now in your own studio at home, recording things you show on YouTube or things of that nature. How does that impact your performance?
Yeah, I always prefer to work with other actors. The analogy I use is a really great volley in tennis, to the point where you don't care who wins the point. It's just such a great volley. And, working with other actors, they will spark you. They will feed you a line, and they won't do it the way you think they're going to do it. And that suddenly sparks you to do your line a little differently than you had planned on doing it. And if all goes well, the performance winds up being elevated. When you work alone, it's like being in a vacuum. You just have to kind of rely on your experience, and all right, I'm angry in this scene, so I'll do angry. And but yeah, I would prefer to work with other actors, but it seems to be happening less and less. Everybody's got a home studio now, and a lot of the producers were really reluctant to use the home studios prior to the pandemic, and then they had to. It was more or less a necessity, and they've come to realize, oh, that's not so bad. The world didn't end. In some cases, the talent studio was not adequate, or their internet connection was poor. I mean, there were some horror stories, but they're a lot more open to it now than they were before the pandemic. And now, when I do show up anywhere in person, the lobbies of these recording studios that used to be filled with laughter and stories and camaraderie, I walk in, it's like Deadsville. I'm the only one there besides the receptionist.
Hmm.
It's so, people ask me, hey, do you stay in touch with some of your old buddies from the GI Joe or whatever? And I said, well, kind of. I see stuff on Facebook. I get an email once in a while. I'll run into them at a convention. That's about the only place I see anybody these days, is when I do a convention.
Hmm.
The rest of the time, I'm flying solo. So it's a double-edged sword. It's nice to be able to get up in the morning and, well, I got a job, but I can do it in my BVDs, as opposed to getting dressed, getting in the car, and spending an hour and a half in hellish traffic to get somewhere. On the other hand, I don't get to interact with the other actors, which is unfortunate. So it is what it is.
You also have a great autobiography called Vocal Recall, a life in radio and voiceovers, which was fantastic. Well, it really is a fantastic. Basically, it's like the how-to manual of becoming a great voice actor. It feels like when you read it, or at least a memoir on how to do so.
Yeah, I don't really want to sell it as a how to get in the business kind of book. It really isn't. It's my autobiography, and you may, if you buy a copy and you read it, and if you don't enjoy the book, look at how thick it is. It makes a hell of a doorstop. This is longer than War and Peace. My wife said, "You ever heard the term editor?" you know, and I said, "You won't know till you do something like this. You try to cut something, it's like cutting one of your fingers off. It's not, I gotta put that in." Next thing you know, you wind up with something like this.
Well,
If anybody is interested, let me throw in a quick plug. It's available at Amazon in the printed version. It's available at Audible in the vocal department. And my book is narrated by a very prominent voice actor, me. I won that audition. It was just amazing. Hundreds of people vied for this plum job, and I just happened to get it. And if you want more details, go to neilbook, neilbook.com. End of commercial.
Well, what I will say is when you look in the show notes, I'll make sure I put a link to your book to make sure people can pick it up who listen to this interview. One interesting about the book, there's been interesting, but one thing that caught my attention is you write in the prologue, you were first seen as a quote goddamn radio announcer.
Yes.
I think it would highlight an important thing, which there's a difference between having a great voice and being a great voice actor. There's a difference between that, and the talent is different. So, what is the difference in skill set of going from having a great voice to being a great voice actor?
Yes, people argue about this. It's almost like the nature nurture argument. Is it the voice? Is it the read? I tend to come down on the side of, well, it's a combination of the two. A perfect example of this would be Don LaFontaine, who did all the movie trailers in the 90s. He was the guy that became famous for saying, "In a world," and he had a very remarkable vocal instrument. But over the years, I've run into other voice actors who had every bit as good of a vocal print as he did, but they didn't have his background. Don LaFontaine started out writing and producing movie trailers, hiring other talent. He wasn't a talent at that point. I mean, he's a talented man, but he didn't function as a voice actor. He would hire other actors to come in, but he would write these things and edit them. And when he eventually decided to become a talent, it was more or less accidental. They were doing a campaign and the actor didn't show up. And what the hell are we going to do? We got to present this in the morning. So finally, Don said, "Oh, I'll go in and do it. And we'll just tell him, well, that's a scratch track and we'll replace it later." So he did the trailer. I forget what it might have been The Elephant Man. And they said, the client said, "Yeah, great. Listen, the person doing the voice, oh, don't worry about him. He'll be replaced." "No, we don't want him replaced. We love him. This is exactly what we want to put on the air." And little by little, he drifted over and ultimately stopped producing these things and became a talent. But the point that I would make is occasionally I would run into other promo trailer people who would be very jealous of him. Why do they hire him all the time? Why don't they hire me? And I said, one of the edges he has is when he looks at a piece of copy, he's already written stuff like he's produced stuff like he knows exactly what they want. You're fumbling around trying to find the read. He knows. I mean, this is right in his pocket. So without the voice, I don't think he'd have had the career he had. On the other hand, his interpretation had a lot to do with how successful he was. He just had a leg up on everybody else because he'd been working both sides of the glass, as it were. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of voice and interpretation.
Would you agree that being a good actor doesn't necessarily make you a good voice actor? In other words, those who are, let's say, in film or television doing live acting might not necessarily be a good voice actor, even though it seems to be those actors are getting the voice acting jobs now.
Yeah, well, you sort of alluded to it a little while back when you referenced that story that happened to me where I was trying to get signed by an agent early in my career in Los Angeles, and he accused me of sounding like a quote unquote goddamn radio announcer. And what he meant was radio, you sort of learn some bad habits. Nobody ever talks about believability when you record a commercial. All they're concerned about is, did you get all the words in? Did you get the phone number correctly? Does it sound good? Whatever the hell that means. And you develop what the late, great Dawes Butler called a cosmetic read. It's good. Get some today. Which screams radio announcer, and the audience, at least the theory is they'll just mentally tune out if they don't physically tune out. The voiceovers they were looking for then, they wanted you to sound not like an announcer. They wanted you to sound like a trusted friend, imparting vitally important information, that sort of thing. And when you've spent 20 years doing this, it's hard to unlearn it and develop a marketable read for voiceovers. And I think it's always been that way. It's a matter of interpretation. You see a really good actor, an Anthony Hopkins, and it just flows effortlessly. But at some point, this was a script they handed him and said, "Here, interpret these words." And whoa, boy, that's a huge assignment to bring that sterile word off the page and make it live. And of course, what Anthony Hopkins and others are doing is very different from selling toilet paper. But whatever they're looking for, you invariably see at the bottom of the copy, "Not an announcer." And so that's the battle, is taking that material and making it sound as though you're not reading something, as though I just thought of this and you need to hear this. Let me explain something here. This is important. But it's somebody else's words. You have to somehow make them yours. It's a difficult task. It's a lot harder than it looks.
Would you say that voice actors don't get the credit they deserve as being the skilled, developed actors that they are?
No, I think lately voice acting has become very prominent. A lot of people are interested in it. When I started out, we were completely unknown, completely anonymous. There weren't that many of us. It was like a little cottage industry that even people in show business didn't know anything about. Occasionally you'd wander on the set of a sitcom to be an announcer in an episode, and radio and isn't that ironic? Stop sounding like a goddamn radio announcer, and then you should. Well, we're looking for a radio announcer, actually. But anyway, you'd be approached sometimes by the on-camera people. Like, "Are you what do you call what do they call it? Voiceovers? What is that? How do I get into that?" Even they didn't know anything about it. But In the last 20 years, it's come out of the closet and everybody knows about it. And I think we get our respect now. The only people we got respect from in the old days were the casting people. They loved us because they would tell us flat out, "You're the most professional actors in town." I mean, these on-camera meatballs, their word, not mine. They're so hard to work with. But you people, we give you a direction, and you give us what we want, you know.
Mhm.
But they were the only ones.
Would you credit that? Is that due to conventions now that people can now see the faces of the people that they loved as characters, or is something else you think that has now risen in the world of voice acting to, let's say, the higher level of respect?
Well, conventions have helped a lot. It's astonishing to me how many conventions there are and how many people show up. And I mean, I did my first convention in 2011, and prior to that, people had been saying you should do conventions. People love you, and I'd say, "Oh, come on." And I just had this mental picture of me sitting at a card table in a hall somewhere being ignored.
Yeah.
And then I did this one in 2011, and I couldn't believe it. They said, "Well, it's time to sign autographs." And fellow actor Greg Berger and I walked out from behind this curtain, and there's this line of people that stretched from Pasadena to
Mhm.
Paso Robles. And I said, "Who the hell are these people here for?" And they said, "You." We couldn't believe it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
When you're at the conventions, what do you find is the character most requested?
In my case, I have sort of four biggies. There's Shipwreck and G.I. Joe. Ahoy, matey. And then there's Springer that you mentioned earlier from Transformers. Keith and Pidge from Voltron, and probably the Green Goblin from Spider-Man, the animated series.
Hmm.
Those are the four biggies, and then to a lesser degree others. But those are sort of my bread and butter parts.
Now, in your autobiography, you also discussed your facility with language in both recalling and in mimicry. So, how does your skill in understanding language, understanding, and having a memorization for words help you also become the successful? Have well, you have had a basically legendary career at this point. How has that been helped by your ability to understand language the way you do and your ability to mimicry?
I started doing it spontaneously as a child. I don't know how old I was, 5, 6, 7. We didn't have a television set, and so it was basically a radio and a record player. And of course, back in the 50s, when I was a little kid, the early 50s, there was still a lot of radio drama available, particularly in Canada, where I was living at the time. We had American shows, we had Canadian radio shows, and we had stuff they brought in from the BBC. And so I was inundated with a lot of different voices and accents, and I became fascinated with them. And at some point began trying to reproduce what I heard. And my father was convinced he'd or not birthed, but fathered a mental case. But somehow it worked out in the long run. As far as mimicry, I'm the world's worst mimic. Again, in the book, I mentioned I got a number of roles based on failed impressions. I mean, really, Shipwreck is a failed impression of Jack Nicholson. And I played the title character in Rambo, and that was a failed impression of Sylvester Stallone, and on and on and on. Uh, my lack of talent in that area seemed to help. But what I was good at, it's not as important now as it used to be. They liked actors who could do two or three voices because the union contract allowed them to ask you to do three different characters in any given project. And so actors who could convincingly come up with three different voices in a session kind of had a leg up on folks who couldn't do that. Nowadays, with everybody working separately, it's not as important as it once was. But that helped me immensely in the early animation work. I got a reputation as somebody you could bring in who could give you three distinct voices, and that helped a lot.
Now, your ability to create those voices, how much of that is just natural physical talent? How much is it a skill that you acquired over learning how to adjust your voice?
It's just sort of a little silly gift that I have and others have. It's to a greater or lesser degree. The best analogy comes from another legendary voice actor named Michael Bell, who's also a teacher, very good teacher. And he said, what we're doing here is playing vocal Mr. Potato Head. If you're familiar with the game, it's an
Yes.
oval and you put noses and mustaches and mouths on it and change its appearance. Well, we're doing that vocally. And so you walk into an audition, there's a picture of the character, there's a 1 or 2 paragraph description of the character, and you assimilate all of this. And then you hopefully begin to hear a voice in your head. And then when you get into the booth, you try to reproduce that voice and hope to hell that the powers that be like it. And it's just a
Question of, is he an old guy? Well, if he's an old guy, is he up here? Is he way down here? Does he have an underbite?
and you can go on for days like this. And you know, occasionally someone will throw a door open and go, "Are you okay in there?" Sounds like you're having a breakdown.
Is there a voice actor equivalent of writer's block? Like, have you ever not been able to find the right voice for a character, or at least to you not find the right voice for a character?
Well, I assume when I do an audition and I don't get the job that I fail to uh, come up with the right character. But now usually I'm able to come up with something, and they've mostly liked it as opposed to not liking it. So I'm very fortunate in that department.
Now you also mentioned other actors in your book as well who inspired you. Peter Sellers, Peter Ustinov, as I said that correct?
Ustinov, yes.
Ustinov. And then how basically you create this great variety of characters and make them real, which are also an important part of being an actor. It's not just be able to do the voice, but you got to make the character real, just more than just the sound,
Yeah,
the
yeah. Well,
person, making it feel real.
that's something that beginners don't understand. Oh, well, I can do a voice. Well, that's great. Can you act in that voice? Can you laugh in that voice? Can you cry in that voice? Can you scream in that voice? Can you make that voice believable? That that was the point that I made about Peter Sellers. It's so long, people don't even know who I'm talking about. But he
Uh,
was a wonderful character actor. I first became aware of him as a child when he was more or less a complete unknown. He was part of a British radio show called The Goon Show. A goon in America means a gangster, but in England, it just meant being silly and gooning around. And he must have done in that show somewhere between 15 and 20 different characters. It was just astonishing. But what really made it interesting for me as a child was even though the voices were outlandish, they became real somehow. You could see them in your mind's eye. He wasn't just doing voices; he acted those voices and made them believable.
hmm.
And that's the big challenge.
Yeah, you came up with this voice,
But can you act? You know, some people can't.
I find to me it always sounds like the hardest thing to do as an actor is fake laughing. I feel like that's the quickest way to sound phony is if you can't laugh well or you're not laughing well. Would you do you agree with that? Is what else is or what would you say is the hardest thing to try to I don't know if fake's the right word, but to create a sound of that act. Let's just say act.
Yeah, I don't recall ever having a problem with laughing on cue. It struck me if I ever dabbled in on camera, the probably the toughest thing to do would be to summon tears.
Hmm.
Um, that's a tough one. Some people can do it and some people can't, and I have a feeling I would be in the can't department. In fact, I remember years ago before I got any even knew about voiceovers. I was in Hawaii. I was a disc jockey, and they were just starting to shoot Hawaii 5-0 as the original Hawaii 5-0 with Jack Lord as I was leaving Hawaii. But I got called in on an audition, And in this scene, my character is supposed to break down and become hysterical and crying and sobbing. And I'm in this little office with this old guy who could care less and his secretary who could care even less. And we get to the crying part, and all of a sudden everybody's staring at me, and I'm looking at this thing. It's just, cries, becomes hysterical. Blah, blah. I said, I don't think I can do this. And the guy said, well, if you can't do it here, you won't be able to do it in front of a camera. Thank you. Nice meeting you. you know, to me, if I ever got involved in on camera and they said, well, now we need you to cry, it would be, uh-oh. Call in the stunt person.
Well, when I've had the pleasure of talking to some other voice actors in the past. They talk about like when you're acting, during your voice acting, you are acting in the studio. You're going full body. You do the whole performance. Is that something that you do as well, or is that something that you just use your voice as your actor, as your performance? How much do you go into the acting when you're in studio?
It sort of varies with me and with other actors, but Michael Bell, to reference him again, one of the things I learned because I took some classes with him is body language is important. You have to use your body. The only caveat is you got to stay on mic. If I start moving around too much, I'm off mic. But you can do anything you want as long as you keep your lips right here. And I remember that we were doing a class with Michael, and this young guy got up and did a scene where he's being menaced by a huge tiger, and he's got his hands in his pockets. And Michael says, "Stop, stop, stop, stop. If you were actually being menaced by a giant tiger, would you have your hands in your pockets? No, I don't know what you do, but sure as hell wouldn't be in your pockets. You got to use your body." And I watched Frank Welker. I don't know if you're familiar with him. One of the most talented people I've ever had the privilege of knowing. But when he wants to ram a line home, he'll throw a fist. I've seen him do this a million times. And I'm going to do this. And it helps. So, yeah, you got to. That's the thing about, again, if I fantasize about on camera, I can deliver, in my opinion, my humble opinion, a pretty good voice performance most of the time, but I have no idea what's happening on the face. I don't know. It could be appropriate. It could be ridiculous. It's a whole other world to me. But yeah, you use a tremendous amount of physicality. You just got to stay on mic while you're doing it.
Now, the other interesting thing too is when you're creating a character, when do you know that you have that character? Is there a point where you're like, I found him, I got him, or is it something that you just kind of play with multiple different attempts when you're being recorded?
Well, I never consider it a job until the check clears. No, things can go wrong. I always figured I had it when we got into about the third or fourth episode, because by then it's too expensive to replace me. But it's like anything else. I remember reading an interesting thing with the late Donald Sutherland, where he said, because they shoot movies sometimes out of sequence. The first day that you work on a movie, you're maybe doing the middle of the movie, not the beginning. And he said he preferred to do the middle first, so that by the time they shoot the opening, he's really got the character down. Is if you establish the character strongly in the beginning of the movie, the audience will overlook slight discrepancies halfway through. So, I mean, the more you do it, the more comfortable you become with it. And I don't know how it is with movies, but with animation, the pressure was really the first couple of episodes, because that's, even though they've given you the job, they can replace you like that. And so you're really on edge those first couple of episodes, afraid somebody's going to go, I don't know, Neil, we're just not hearing it. And then I say, next comes the call from the agent. Well, I'm sorry, they went another way. That hasn't happened to me very often, but it can happen.
Now, so something, as you mentioned, the heroes you've played is Shipwreck, Springer, Pidge, Ace McCloud from Centurions. When is there like is there such thing as like a hero's voice? that you find, or is it different for every character? Is there something kind of like a go-to to make sure you have whatever that makes it, whatever that makes that hero a hero,
Yeah.
voice?
Yeah, it just sort of depends on the character. Um, Obviously, if you're portraying a hyper masculine person, you want to get down into the lower, grittier part of your voice. But people who are not in the business, some of them seem to think that, well, I have 18 voices, and I show up for a job, and I say, well, I think for this one I'll use number 11. It isn't like that. It's vocal Mr. Potato Head. And in retrospect, sometimes I'll do a character and I'll go, that's really pretty close to something I did a couple of years ago. But you know, as an agent, I used to have said, if you think about it, there are subtle differences. I said, okay, that's what I'll use. Subtle differences. Yeah.
Did you approach your villains differently than your heroes?
Well, villains, I think, are more fun. Heroes are sort of one note. I'll save you, Nell, and you do that over and over again for 65 episodes. Whereas villains are always trying to think of some way to do something horrible, and that's for some perverse reason more fun to act. I'm sure if you talk to other actors who've done villains, they'll tell you, well, you don't make as much money as the lead guy, but you have more fun. So,
who's been your favorite villain to play?
Oh, well, I think probably Green Goblin.
Green Goblin.
Yeah, yeah. Particularly in that iteration, I've actually done 3 different Green Goblins, and the final one I did in the '90s, the Spider-Man, the animated series. I got to do both Green Goblin and Norman Osborn, and that was fun, ping-ponging between the two. And of course,
Green Goblin was over the top.
And that was fun. That was fun. I enjoyed that.
And going back to what you said about the different voices you can do, there's a quote in your book. I'm just going to read the quote. People often ask you, how many voices do you do? And you reply, I have no idea and I hope to never find out.
Yeah.
Kind of talk about what you mean by I hope I never find out.
Well, I was going for humor, but you like to think you could play anything. You have an unlimited range of possibilities in here. It's just a question of picking the right thing and or the right combination of things. But yeah, as I said, I don't have 18 voices and just choose one depending on this. It's just you walk in, you see a picture, you read a description, you start fooling around vocally and hope that what you came up with is something they'll like.
Mm. Now, one interesting thing is that we're currently this year has been the 40th anniversary of G.I. Joe when it first premiered, which has gone by for me since I watched it as a kid. It seems to have gone by faster than I would have wanted it to, but 40 years, here we are. And you played some of the characters you played were Shipwreck and Buzzer, and obviously many others. Um, what do you find as the biggest impact of your performances, especially for Shipwreck? Because I think Shipwreck is like your most famous G.I. Joe character, if I had to guess for one. But what have you found like as the impact of your character, the impact of that performance of Shipwreck?
Yeah, it's interesting. G.I. Joe, the characters seem to be kind of stereotyped. I mean, it was a show for young people, so it's not like we're doing Tennessee Williams here, but the good guys were really good and the bad guys were really bad. And then in the middle, you had Shipwreck, who was sort of straddling the fence. He wanted to do the right thing, but he didn't like taking orders. And so he would try to do things his way, and he would wind up in all sorts of hilarious situations as a result. And to me, that was a very rewarding character to play, as opposed to a one note good guy or one note bad guy. So that ability to sort of straddle the fence was what made that character interesting to me anyway. I don't know about the audience, but
And the thing about G.I. Joe, and I'm just guessing because obviously I wasn't there, you were. There's so many different characters in G.I. Joe, right? And which means there's so many different actors. When you're performing, I mean, it's almost like an ensemble from episode to episode, depending who was going to be like featured that one episode, other than Snake Eyes, who didn't have any voice and happened to be in a lot of shows. It was cheaper to have Snake Eyes in an episode. Um, because there's so many different characters, and at any given time, one or two of those characters was going to be the focal point of that episode. Was there a competitive nature on within the actors, making sure that their character became maybe the most noticeable?
No, the voice community back then, I don't know about now. It was one of the most generous groups of people I've ever encountered. Voice actors back in the good old days were friendly, supportive. We sort of had this attitude like voiceover jobs are like buses. If you miss this one, there's another one coming in 10 minutes and you'll get on that one. And so, no, I think we were all happy to be there. And if an episode came along where it was 90% Michael Bell and I had two lines, well, that's fine. You know, next time around, maybe it'll be the other way. It reminded me sort of repertory companies in theaters where maybe when they do Hamlet, you play Hamlet, but maybe when they do King Lear, you just have three minor parts because that's what's right for you.
Hmm.
And nobody gets jealous. It's just that's what we're doing right now. And that was kind of the way it was with voiceovers. You know, occasionally, I'm sure this has happened to every actor. You read for something, you think you were absolutely brilliant. They pick somebody else, you hear what they're doing, and you go, why him? I don't get that. I nailed it. I know I did. But, you know, you can scream that to the heavens all you want. They picked him. And but you know, occasionally on camera actors would stumble into our world for some reason or other, and they would always comment on how generous and friendly everybody seemed to be. As apparently in the on camera world, it's not like that. They're kind of cutthroat, or they were, you know.
And I think what is kind of interesting is that you also reference in your book, about Transformers and how you found that how or the joke comment was how the toys are selling depended on who gets the most screen time, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And I mean, is there, like I said, was there like was that competitive? Like, did you know like well my character's obviously selling most toys since I'm in script?
No, we were completely cut off from all of that. It's a very compartmentalized business. If you're an actor, you act. If you're a writer, you write. If you're a director, you direct. And we just had no contact with anything involving the toys. We knew they existed, but I don't think I even saw a Shipwreck figure till I started going to conventions.
Yeah.
But this all grew out of I forget there were one of the women who was in GI Joe, as I tell this story in the book, and it's true. She showed up for a session, and she hadn't worked on the show for a few months. And as she's walking in, one of the producers is walking out, and he says, "Hey, nice to see you. I haven't seen you for a while." She says, "Oh, I haven't been in any of the shows for a while." He says, "Yeah, that's because your doll isn't selling." And he left. And she came to us and she said, "Was he joking or is that real?" And we, of course, we had no answer. And so we started joking. Well, if you don't work on the show for a couple of months, go down to Toys R Us and buy a couple dozen of your of your action figure, and maybe you'll get a job. You know, but as I say, we were so cut off from that end of it that we didn't know anything.
Well, that does seem a little bit unfair. It's just as far as you would assume, as especially as a little boy as well, the girl toys would never sell as well as the boy toys, probably regardless of the performance, because boys tend to buy boy toys. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, the target audience, as it was explained to me back then, anyway, was boys between 12 and 14. And I'm sure we had plenty of female fans and fans who were older and younger than that. But that was the target audience. That's what we were shooting for. At least that's what they told us.
Is it weird for you that now people like me in my 40s are approaching you about these characters that are supposed to be for 12 to 14-year-olds?
Well, it's not weird anymore. I've gotten used to it, but no, we were all of us to a man or woman absolutely amazed uh, when these conventions started happening and fans started showing up and wanting our autographs. We couldn't believe it. The common idea when we did these shows, which was the mid 80s, was that if you were lucky, you'd get 3 or 4 seasons and then your audience would outgrow you. And the new audience that was growing up wouldn't want an old show their older brother watched. And so that show would go on the shelf and a new show would have to be produced. And the idea that anybody would remember or care about this stuff 40 plus years later, they'd have put you in a loony bin if you suggested that. So yeah, we're absolutely amazed by it. And as I say in the book, at the time, these shows were described contemptuously by some people as, they're nothing but half-hour toy commercials. But if that's all they were, then nobody would remember us 40 years later. I'm convinced of it. And there are shows you referenced Ace McLeod in Centurions, which I was doing roughly around the same time that I did G.I. Joe and Transformers. Nobody ever mentions that show. I don't even carry pictures from the show to conventions for autograph signing. Nobody wants them. Nobody cares about that show. I don't know why. Why Transformers and G.I. Joe and, and Spider-Man to a degree and Voltron. I don't know why those are remembered and other shows I did and worked just as hard and sincerely on as I did those. Nobody cares anymore. It's all gone like it never happened.
Well, I will say, having prepared for the show, I did get to go back and watch some Centurions, and I watched G.I. Joe, and I watched the Transformers cartoon and the film. I will say G.I. Joe, in terms of, do have something feel like there's more than Centurions as far as the amount what you could on screen. Like,
Yeah.
the imagination goes further, I think, with G.I. Joe and Transformers.
Yeah, I'd have to sit down. I don't think I ever watched a single episode of Centurions. I really haven't watched very much of any of the shows.
Yeah.
When they were on the air, we were all working. They ran in the afternoon, weekday afternoons. Well, you'd be on the road. You'd be ping-ponging from an audition to a session. You didn't have time to sit and try to look at one of these things. And at some point, I got a VCR, and I would record them and take a look at a few and try to get a feel for the show. But I've watched relatively few of these shows. To me, the fun is doing them, not sitting and watching them. I want to watch somebody else's show.
Well, I must say those shows were a huge part of my childhood, and like I said, with Centurions, Transformers, and GI Joe all at once, that was a hell of a period of shows that became legendary in those 80s. And I would argue the 80s and mid 90s were the best era for cartoons. I don't know how you feel.
Well, there are people who tell us that at conventions. That's their feeling. Of course, animation for adults really didn't exist back then. And now, of course, it does. I mean, The Simpsons and Family Guy and, of course, South Park. And these are not kiddie shows. I mean, come on. So that's a whole different. I don't know that I've ever worked on a show like that. That's a whole different kettle of fish. That didn't exist in the 80s at all.
Now, one thing as well, having to do all these voices, another great part in your book that we can reference, you talk about what's called a throat-ripping voice.
Yeah.
A voice that's at the top of your lungs, usually, I remember the actor that you've referenced to, that did the most, but it's like I'm sure Frank Welker did a few, Peter Cullen did some deep ones. How concerned are you that you can damage your voice? And how do you care for your voice in a way that's allowed to then just bounce back when you do your next performance?
Yeah, it's all a case of placement, and some people can scream. I mentioned the late great Chris Latta. Who could just do these sorts of things? And he could do it for hours on end. And didn't seem to suffer any ill effects. I found with my voice, I actually discovered this a million years ago when I was a track announcer for roller derby in Hawaii. I would scream myself hoarse at night. I mean, to the point where I barely talk by the end of the evening. But somehow, if I went home, got in bed, and got 8 hours sleep, I'd get up in the morning and my voice would be fine. But some of these games, they want every line screamed, and they do multiple takes. And I tell people, no matter how great it sounds, if you can't do it without feeling some strain or pain after 5 or 10 minutes, don't even. I mean, I have come up with voices at auditions where they've said, "Oh, we like that," and I'm over in the corner going, "You may like it, guys, but I can't do it
Right.
for hours on end." Uh, and as I say, some people, there's an actor you may be familiar with, David Sobolov, and we were talking about this. And he said, "I can scream all day long, doesn't do me any damage and all." I said, "Well, then go do those jobs, David, with my blessing. I don't even go near that stuff." In fact, it got so bad that we actually had a clause written into the union contract where if there's a lot of screaming going to happen in a show, they have to tell you up front.
Really?
This will require a lot of screaming. And most of the time when I see that, I tell my agent, please tell them respectfully, I'm not going to submit an audition because I just don't want to scream.
Yeah.
And yes, a lot of us were concerned about either permanently damaging our voices or being out of action for 3 or 4 days after doing one of these. It's a consideration.
Now, the one I remember I interviewed an actor maybe a year or two ago, Fred Tatasciore, who famous for doing the Hulk in the Avengers movie, The Incredible Hulk, and he talked about the regimen he had to do to keep his voice in good shape, considering the character he was using. I'm sure he was doing voice ripping regularly. Is there something that you do as well to make sure, like, or actors who do like a regimen to make sure their voice isn't damaged by this?
Huh. I'm so lazy. Years ago, I thought I'm one of these days I'm going to make an appointment with a really hotshot voice doctor. And I'm just going to say, tell me everything. Tell me what I need to do. And I never got around to it. Uh, what seems to save me, even all these years later, is if I do get into some kind of vocal difficulty, as long as I can get 8 hours of sleep, somehow I'm back to normal in the morning. Somehow, whatever mysterious process happens in here.
Well, I see. I think that's amazing because I know. I mean, I don't voice act, but I'm a teacher, and I've had days where I'm yelling at my kids kind of loudly, and I will say my voice the next day is sore. I will be in pain for the next day or so. I can't imagine doing it every single day and just being able to wake up normal and be like, I'm good.
Yeah. That seems to work for me. Sleep. That's the big one.
Do you know actors who have damaged their voice doing that kind of voice ripping for days and days, or is that just a cautionary concern?
Um, Nobody specific that I'm aware of, but I'm sure it's happened. I'm
Hmm.
sure people have been knocked out of commission for a week or more, and some may have suffered permanent damage, but I don't specifically know of anybody in particular.
Well, going back to G.I. Joe, because like I said, we're at the 40th anniversary, I want to talk about Shipwreck, who is such a great character. And I had to watch the old G.I. Joe episodes again, and I must say he is a unique character in a franchise where there's not that many unique characters, it seems like. Like you said, the voices tend to be somewhat similar. They're all kind of heroes, good guys. Shipwreck kind of plays a little bit on the edge a little bit. There's one episode where I think it was a news crew is trying to film G.I. Joe, and he kind of gets them to see what it really looks like being, and he kind of like gets them to go like into like a hazard zone and where they're fighting the Cobra and all that stuff. It's very cool. In your opinion, what makes Shipwreck such an endearing character that's lasted 40 years? People still buying reissues of his toys and everything else.
Well, I think it's his iconoclastic personality. I think it's that quirky refusal to do things by regulation. I think people love a lovable rogue, which I guess is the way I would describe him.
Mm.
I think that's why he was fun for the audience, fun for me. Uh, Probably one of the two best characters I ever had. And I'll always be grateful that I got that one.
When you're performing for Shipwreck, how much is the performance was on the page? How much is it that your performance has influenced the character since?
Oh gosh, that's unknowable, you know.
Yeah.
I just, you know, I try to analyze myself. I work mainly through instinct. I just, if you give me a character and you give me a story, I somehow seem to know what to do. Um, but it's nothing that I could put into words.
Mm.
That's why Michael Bell is such a great teacher. He has analyzed acting, and he can give you really strong, practical advice. Uh, I just, you know, basically show up, look at the situation, and somehow the way to read the lines comes to me
Mm.
organically, instinctively, somehow,
And
if
I would
all
say,
goes well.
well, one of the great stories you have also in your book, and like I said, it's a phenomenal book, is when you talk about how Jack Nicholson and his role in The Last Detail influenced how you create Shipwreck. So,
Yeah.
what about Nicholson's performance? Was it the voice? Was it the performance? Was it just the role that brought you to Shipwreck from Jack Nicholson?
Yeah. Well, when I auditioned for Shipwreck, I went in and there's the picture of the character and one or two paragraph description. And I go in and I do two or three takes, and they're obviously not thrilled. And I couldn't think of anything else to do. So I was seconds away from going, all right, thanks, guys. Nice to see you. And there happened to be a guy in the studio sitting over in the corner, and he very quietly said to me, have you ever seen The Last Detail? And thank God I had. It was a small Hal Ashby movie, which starred Jack Nicholson. And he actually got nominated for an Academy Award for the performance. He didn't win. I think he got a Golden Globe. But anyway, a year or two later, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and then Chinatown, and people kind of forgot about The Last Detail.
Mm.
But I had seen it, and what flashed in my mind was a scene that happens midway through the movie in a bar, which I think you can find on YouTube still. Last Detail bar scene. And I had this voice that I used to do. It was sort of my all-purpose stoner voice, you know, hey man, you holding. And people occasionally would say, that sounds kind of like Jack Nicholson. So I thought, well, maybe I'll go with that voice. But mainly it was in my mind as I read the audition lines, was this what he did in this bar scene in The Last Detail. And that's kind of where it came from. And of course, Jack doing these adult oriented movies, the kids your age probably weren't that familiar with him, because I don't think too many people were taking their 10-year-old kids to see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you
That,
know.
I would agree. I would have been, God, 6 or 7 years old. I will wager I did not see any of those movies, or probably know who Jack Nicholson was at the time.
Yeah, I think that's when he went sort of mainstream. But
Yeah.
prior to that, he was definitely an adult act. And so our audience probably, instead of thinking, well, that guy's ripping off Jack Nicholson, they just thought, oh, this is an interesting new voice.
And I will say though, even to this day, I've not seen The Last Detail. What was it about the performance Jack Nicholson did that you thought Shipwreck was the closest connection to that?
Well, the Last Detail, in a nutshell, it's about these two. Detail in this sense, in a military sense, means assignment. The way you would title it in a civilian situation is the last assignment. Well, this was the last detail, and they are detailed to take this other young sailor to do 8 years in the brig at Portsmouth.
Mm.
And they feel like he got a raw deal, and they're kind of ticked off, and they say, let's show this kid a good time before he has to go to prison. And so they have all kinds of wild misadventures. And Jack's character is Billy Badass Badusky, and he's a career Navy guy, enlisted. And I actually was in the Navy myself, and so the character he played reminded me of guys I knew who were lifers, as we called them, and they learned how to kind of play the system a little bit. And so they would skate along just this close to insubordination, but somehow they would get away with it with a combination of bravado and luck. And as I watched him in the last detail, I thought, God, I knew guys like this. I absolutely knew people like this. It gave me a lot to work with. And it's a wonderful little movie if you can track it down. It's well worth the time. It's a lovely movie.
So when you're, like I said, because Shipwreck became such a famous character, what was it like in actually recording in for Shipwreck when you were doing GI Joe? Was it? I mean, everyone's doing their voices, everyone's doing their characters. What was it like for you? Were people commenting on how interesting your character was because it felt so much different than all the others? Was everyone just kind of palling around with each other on set?
Um, yeah, we didn't comment on each other's performances. That was sort of an unwritten rule. You just don't want to go there. I mean, sometimes if somebody gave a particularly bad line reading, we would have a humorous comment to make. But generally speaking, you minded your own business. You played your part, the other person played their part, and hopefully all would be well. It's if anybody's going to comment on what I'm doing, it should be the director, not the guy standing to my left. You play your part, I'll play mine. If he's not happy, he'll tell us.
Now, no, you're recording for Shipwreck. Was the animation already complete and you had to match it, or were the animations based on your performance?
No, the way it works most of the time is the scripts get written, and then virtually the first thing that takes place is the voice tracks are recorded. Then the voice tracks are handed to the animators, and they animate to the voice tracks. And there have been cases where what they planned on doing ends up being quite different based on what the voice actor did. In fact, sometimes they will put a camera and they will record you doing the voice, and sometimes that inspires the artists, just looking at what happens on your face. So that the only show that I did that was different was Voltron, which was actually based on two existing Japanese shows. And so in that case, the picture was already locked down and we had to fit in with the picture, but that's not the way it's done 99% of the time.
Is there room for ad-libbing in animation as there are sometimes in film or television?
Yeah, it varies from director to director. Some are open to it. Some would prefer that you just do exactly the way it's written. Without being obnoxious, if I think of something, I think, boy, that would really smack, I'll throw it in.
Mm.
And sometimes they go, oh, that's interesting. And sometimes that's funny, Neil, but could you please just read what Morty wrote?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that you've done a lot of is voice acting for video games. Is that different than television and film voice acting? And in what ways is it the same or different?
Well, initially it was different because we worked alone, and we didn't. And in a lot of cases, there isn't a sort of a story for you to follow. You're just doing isolated lines, and you don't even know why you're doing them. And in some cases, the person directing doesn't know why you're saying these things because these games are so huge.
Right.
And so that's a bit of a challenge. Initially, when I would do an animation session, all the actors would be there. And then when I go to do a game, it's just me, and I don't have a story I can tell. Fortunately, by the time games came along, I'd been doing this long enough where I can say, well, I can see based on the context of this line that my character is pissed off. So I'll play pissed off, even though I don't know why. Earlier in my career, that would have been a challenge. But by the time I got there, I had done so much of this stuff that it was relatively easy.
When you're reading doing the voice for a character, as you mentioned that because it's video games that they don't give you either a backstory or much about the character, do you create your own backstory, or are you developing the character kind of like in your own head canon, or are you just doing the emotion and assuming it's going to work out?
A lot of times there isn't time. And as I say, there's no coherent plot line. So
Mm.
you just have to look at the context and go angry here. All right, I'll do angry. Neutral here. I'll do neutral, and so forth. It's a little bit of a guessing game, but occasionally I'll see a little bit of a finished product and I'll say, oh, that didn't turn out too badly. You know,
Have you ever played one of the video games that you're in, or no?
no, no. As I mentioned in my book, they used to send us copies of the game. They don't anymore.
Oh,
Yeah, it's been years since anybody sent me anything. Not that I'm complaining. Anyway, they sent me this game, and I thought, well, I'd like to evaluate my performance. So I shoved in the whatever the thing
oh.
was and loaded it on my computer and tried to play it. I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do. I just want to hear my voice. Stop, you know. And suddenly my computer completely crashed.
Oh
And
no.
I had to hire a guy and pay him $200 to get it working again. And he said, these games, they can kind of freeze computers, and maybe you should get a second computer for games. I said, I got a better idea. How about I just don't play games at all? He said, well, that'll work. So, no, the closest I came, my daughter, when she was young, uh, got a copy of The Curse of Monkey Island
Okay.
that I was in, and she tried to play that, and I would go in and try to help her because she'd get frustrated at certain points, and I saw a little bit of that. That's the
Mm.
closest I ever came.
So be able to having you wrote your book, you've looked back at your entire career, which has been a long. You've done some amazing characters. Well, what do you normally like? What do you usually think when you reflect upon this a wonderful career that you've had?
Oh, I kind of ping pong between, boy, I'm amazed I got this far, and then 2 seconds later, I'm amazed I didn't get further. It's But yeah, when I think, I mean, when I got out of high school and hit the road, my ambition was to be a disc jockey on KFWB in Los Angeles. And I never achieved that because by the time I got within spitting distance of that, a market the size of Los Angeles, KFWB had gone to all news. And
Mm.
I was not a news guy. They weren't playing music anymore. So that was out the window. But, I went from just aspiring to be a local Los Angeles disc jockey to suddenly doing stuff that was running nationwide, worldwide in some cases.
Mm.
And I'm pretty amazed that I got to do what I did. The voiceover thing was a real Hail Mary. I was close to 40 years old and really hadn't achieved that much in the way of success. And if voiceovers hadn't come along, I don't know what would have happened to me because the radio business was deteriorating at that point, and it got much, much worse in the mid
Mm.
90s. I'm sure I would have been unceremoniously kicked out somewhere around 1996.
Mm.
But voiceovers opened up a whole new world for me, and it really, in some ways, amazes me because I really didn't know if I had any talent at all. There wasn't anybody to, when I was in these smaller towns who I felt was qualified to even comment.
Mm.
What did they know? I think the first inkling I had of that I might have something was when I talked to that agent, the same agent that accused me of sounding like a radio announcer. I had two reels. I had one reel with my commercials and the other reel with animation. And he hated the straight announce stuff. But boy, he started listening to the animation tape, and he said, "Oh, this I can do something with this." And he ended up not signing me anyway. But that gave me a glimmer of hope.
Mm.
Well, this is a professional. He works in this industry, and he seems to like what he's hearing. So maybe I got a shot.
So what's next for you?
Oh, well, I'm you don't celebrate at this point. You observe my 81st birthday in December.
Congratulations.
So these days I wake up, I open one beady little eye, I look around. If I don't see flowers and candles, I get up. And that's pretty much it.
I mean, like I said, your career has been amazing. And as you mentioned in your book, I'm one of those people who do look at what you've done, like Transformers and G.I. Joe, and say that you helped create my childhood. So I want to thank you so much, sir. You've been absolutely amazing to talk with, and people should pick up your book because it's absolutely fascinating.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, Jeff. I hope I was semi-coherent through most
Indeed.
of this. I did my best.
Well, thank you so much, sir.
All right, Jeff. Thank you.